there's very little correlation between fame and affluence and happiness. Like I was thousands of times happier living in my abandoned factory making $2,000 a year than I was living in a 5-level penthouse overlooking Central Park.
Got a lot to get into with you. You've had a very interesting life and you've done a lot of different things. So we got a lot to talk about. But where I want to start is talking about something you've shared publicly where you said that animal rights activism is your job and your hobby is making music. So I'm curious, how far back does that go?
Well, I'm hesitant to use the word hobby because hobby sounds sort of, I don't know, belittling or diminished. Making music is sort of, and I don't even know the right way to describe it without sounding too pretentious or self-involved, but for me, making music is more like, I guess, a spiritual practice. And technically it generates revenue, but that's not my goal in making music. Like I make music simply for the love of being able to work on music. But when I say that my job is animal rights, I mean that's that's more of sort of like a worldly purpose. Like if you held a gun to my head and said I had to choose between music and animal rights, I would very sadly have to choose animal rights because when I look at it globally, it's just simply more important than almost anything else.
And what I'm getting at, I guess, is if we take that all the way back to 1999, 2000, when Play comes out, would you have said the same thing back then, or would music have been the priority?
Well, back then, I was the priority. And what I mean by that is really for a lot of my life, I was just very, very selfish. I got sober in 2008. And before getting sober, I was, like a lot of people, just very self-involved, very focused on myself. And so, I've been a vegan now for 33 years and I've been, politically active and an activist for a long time. But honestly, for most of that time, everything took a back seat to my selfishness. And, like my criteria in assessing things had very little to do with the idea of being of service. It was simply how was I best able to be of service to myself? Of course, paradoxically, that ended up creating a lot of unhappiness and depression. And I found that actually, like, by trying to be of service to causes or even concepts that are bigger than me, that actually creates more sustainable happiness.
I hear what you're saying. Let's talk about that period of time in your life when that switch happened.
Okay.
So you mentioned you're really self-centered and just looking out for yourself and your own well-being. Talk about the switch and now you've, transcended and all your energy goes to, or a lot of your energy goes to others and especially these animals that can't speak for themselves. So let's talk about that period in your life where that transition happened and over what period of time did that happen?
Uh, well, I would say that, uh, I mean, as a species, we are programmed, I almost think, on a hardwired level as a result of heredity and evolution. We are kind of sadly programmed to be self-involved. We're programmed to have a lot of fear and a lot of selfishness, or maybe rather than trying to include everyone else, I'll just say I was programmed to have a lot of fear and a lot of selfishness. And I never questioned it because we don't live in a world where you're encouraged to question selfishness. If anything, we live in a world that sort of celebrates self-interest and selfishness. Like, of course, people give lip service to philanthropy and altruism, but really, ultimately, we live in a culture that prioritizes selfishness above all else. And I weirdly, sadly bought into that. I had been a philosophy major. I was raised by hippies and academics. And I was very politically involved, and I was been an animal rights activist for a long time. But really, as I mentioned before, my ultimate goal was serving myself. And the irony there is the more I served myself, the more selfish I was, the more resources I had to really go after that selfishness. Because I grew up very poor, very, poor white trash on food stamps and welfare. And then as my music career started taking off, I suddenly had, fame and a degree of affluence. And I started drinking more and doing more drugs and just constantly thinking about how I could create more selfish happiness for myself. And the more I was able to build this sort of like temple of selfishness and degeneracy, the less happy I was. And finally, my long winded answer to your question, finally in 2008, I just realized like, oh, it wasn't working anymore. You know, the selfishness was creating despair for me, for the people around me. And I had to finally look at that evidence, and be willing to accept that my purely selfish approach to things just simply wasn't working.
So at that point when the switch flipped, was that when you were at your rock bottom when it came to drugs, alcohol, and partying?
Oh, absolutely. Uh, I mean, it was a spiritual bottom, it was an existential bottom, it was an alcohol and drugs bottom. I mean, it was sort of, it was a very desperate time, around, I say from about 2004 until about 2008 when I got sober. It was just like this desperate flailing and grabbing for anything that seemed like it would create happiness, even for just a few minutes.
What I'm really curious about is the fact that you took this period of time in your life when everything was going, on the outside, it probably looked like things were going well with the money and the fame and the success, but inside things were falling apart. And for you, you took that rock bottom and pivoted into a positive direction, whereas a lot of people, just keep spiraling downward. So I'm curious what the difference is there for you, how you took that time and use that as a catalyst for change. Like, what's different about you that you're able to do that?
It's a good question, and I don't know, because in a way, it had very little to do with me. Like meaning, as I was spiraling down, I didn't see a way out. Uh, but then somehow, I think I just realized maybe it's the rational part of me. Like when I was a philosophy major at university, like whenever we had debates, we had to support our positions with logic and evidence. So maybe I was trained to think that way, to be able to assess a situation and apply the criteria of logic and evidence. And I guess around 2007, 2008, I started doing that to my life. And I finally, sadly, had to admit, like, logically, rationally, looking at all the evidence, like, what I was doing wasn't working. But then, and this is the scary thing, and I think this is why so many people continue on with bad behavior, is the bad behavior is familiar. Whether it's a bad relationship, a bad work environment, alcohol or drug addiction. I mean, all the types of sort of, I don't know, like really insidious bad behavior that are parts of all of our lives. Even if we're willing to see that it's bad, it's sometimes really hard to move past it because it's so familiar. But somehow, I guess that's the benefit of bottoming out as an alcoholic and a drug addict. Like the evidence was so overwhelming, I really couldn't continue living that way.
And it's interesting too, as somebody who's bottoming out and making this great change towards the positive in their life, you're somebody who at the time is a public figure. So I'm curious, like, how much of that was public at the time, or how much of that time did you kind of wall off and go inward to evolve?
Uh, I mean, luckily, it was sort of before social media. this was the days of Friendster. Like, I think MySpace had just sort of been invented. So it was definitely not, and maybe like the very beginnings of Facebook. So it wasn't, I luckily didn't have the potential to overshare. And also I didn't know what I was doing. Like in terms of, getting sober or rejecting a very pernicious, selfish past, I I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know what the future was going to look like. I didn't know what a healthier, happier, more sustainable life was going to look like. All I knew was that the old life didn't work anymore. So in terms of being public about it, no, at the time I wasn't at all. Largely because I didn't really know what I would share. Like it's a lot easier to talk about it now that I've got, like that was what, 13 years ago. And I've had 13 years of sort of figuring some things out, putting things together, and living in a way that has proven to be more sustainable. So I can talk about that. But at the time, I was stepping out of like a horrible familiar into a complete unknown.
And I'm really interested on that whole aspect of the unknown when it comes to the art, the music. You had been performing and you know, you talk about the drugs and the alcohol, and you'd been living this certain lifestyle that was really destructive to you personally. But were you worried at that time when you were going to clean things up and change things up in a profound way, how that was going to impact the music, the art?
Well, luckily, see, I fell in love with music when I was very young, when I was around 3 years old. And I never thought I would have a career as a musician. But then when I started to have a career as a musician, I started thinking about my career, and so I loved the music, but I also loved having a career, and I loved fame, and I loved everything that came along with it. And so I started thinking of music, less as a spiritual practice, and more for a minute as a way of, trying to have more of a career, have more fame. And luckily, once I got sober and had a degree of spiritual change, I simply was able to see music with clean, fresh eyes again. And I was able to see that, you know, that music for me, like if I make music and it becomes commercially successful, that's fine, but that can't be the goal. Like the goal is music as a spiritual practice. And that it was just really nice to have that sort of reorientation, to realize that like the world of commercial compromise makes me I think it kind of makes me sick to my stomach, and I can't believe that there were a few years that I sort of bought into that, before I got sober.
You talk about being hungry for the fame. I'm curious if that goes all the way back. You talked about growing up dirt poor and being on food stamps. Do you think a lot of that comes from having that upbringing where things were so hard and you wanting to prove something to yourself, to other people?
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily proving. It was basically motivated by fear and feelings of inadequacy. Because when I was growing up, I grew up very poor, but I grew up in a very wealthy community. And so every day I went to school aware of the fact that, like my clothes were secondhand. Um, on summer vacation, I sat around and watched black and white TV while my friends went to the country club. It was just a lot of feelings of inadequacy and shame. And when I started to have a degree of fame, it seemed like this was a way of finding legitimacy, of finding a degree of, like moving past feelings of inadequacy. So, but it was never about thinking of myself as better than other people. It was actually just thinking that fame would maybe get me to the point where I didn't feel less than other people.
And I've heard you say in the beginning when you first got into music, you could have never dreamt of becoming famous and where things went.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, the first band I was in, the first concert we ever played, was quite literally to an audience of 0 people. Um, and then when I started making records on my own in the late 80s, early 90s, I mean, the first single I released sold maybe 1,000 copies. And I thought even that was pretty miraculous that 1,000 people had bought one of my singles. So, so no, I never expected fame or success at all. I thought I would be teach philosophy at a community college, which would have been fine. Like I don't say that in a demeaning or bad way, but I thought I was going to be a philosophy professor who made music in his spare time and certainly never had any musical career or success.
And I've heard you talk about you almost thought after some of the success came that you might have to go back and teach philosophy. Before Play came out, you kind of, well, not
Mhm.
kind of, you had a big dip in your career when you released a punk rock record. I think it was 1996. And then, everything you'd been building up sort of fell apart.
Yeah, in 96, 97, um, the few years of success that I'd had before that seemed to sort of crumble. And also personally, like I was battling alcoholism. My mom had just died of cancer. I lost my record deal. I released an album called Animal Rights that almost no one cared about or liked. And I really thought, okay, well, might, I might have to give up this idea of being a professional musician and get my PhD and try and get a job teaching. Uh, I mean, I remember the apartment I was living in at the time had a monthly cost of around $300. Because when you own an apartment in New York, you still have to pay a monthly cost. And one of the things that I found reassuring about that is I was convinced that I would still be able to collect enough cans to pay $300 a month for my apartment. Because in my past, like when I'd been broke, I'd gone out and collected cans and bottles, and I just knew that like if I really had to, I could collect enough cans and bottles to pay a $300 a month fee for my apartment.
So when that punk rock record came out, you hadn't made it in a big way financially at that point at all.
I mean, I had made some money, but not. I mean, I'd had some success, but not enough to sustain me long term. It wasn't. It certainly wasn't. I didn't have retirement funds unless I was, I don't know, retiring somewhere where you could live on $2 a day.
Well, let's go back and get into how you fell in love with animals in the beginning. And I know this goes back to finding a kitten in the dump. You can tell me, I forget exactly how old you were at the time. You were a kid. And that relationship you had with that animal, plus a lot of other animals you had in the home. Your parents had, I think your dad had worked at a college and brought some rats back that you guys had as pets. And there were a lot of animals in the home. I'll let you set the scene, but I want to get a feel for that love early on that you formed for animals.
Well, a lot of it came from very early childhood, like from maybe the time I was born until the time I was 2 or 3. Uh, my parents lived in a basement apartment in Harlem. This was the mid to late 60s. And they were, and I say this with respect, they were very dysfunctional, with their own alcohol abuse, their own issues. And I think there was a lot of fighting. My dad died when I was 3. Uh, but I think that environment, that basement apartment in Harlem, there was just a lot of chaos and a lot of anger and arguing. And at an early age, I learned that the animals we lived with, which at the time was, I guess, 2 cats, 1 or 2 dogs, it was a very crowded apartment, and a bunch of lab rats. And the animals were safe. The animals were predictable. The animals didn't argue. They behaved in a very rational way. And so I think early on, I kind of almost decided like, okay, humans are unpredictable and violent, and animals are actually predictable and safe. And that's kind of when it started. Uh, and then as I grew up, I grew up in a home filled with rescue animals. My mom and I kept rescuing more dogs, more cats, lizards, mice, rats. Like there were just a lot of animals around, and I loved the animals we had in our house, I loved them all unconditionally, but I had th- one of our human paradoxes, which was I loved animals, but I also loved going to Burger King. And then you were referring to this cat that I rescued when I was around 10 years old. I was walking by our town dump and I heard a tiny little meow come from a box. And I opened up this box, and inside the box, there were three dead kittens, tiny, tiny kittens, and this one barely alive kitten who was maybe 4 days old, 5 days old. His eyes were still shut, and he was mewing. And I scooped him up and I took him home. And my mom and I were living with my grandmother at this point. And my grandmother had an old cranky dachshund named George, and George became this cat's mother and nursed him back to health. Not literally, George was a man and a dog and not lactating, but like George really saved the cat's life. And the cat was named Tucker. And I really, truly unconditionally loved Tucker, even almost more unconditionally than the love I had for other animals. And then when I was 19, so this is 9 years later, I was petting Tucker, and all of a sudden I had what I think of as this moment where the paradox in my brain was healed. Um, and I suddenly realized that like Tucker was this sentient being with two eyes and a central nervous system and an incredibly rich emotional life and a deep desire to avoid pain and suffering. And in an instant, I realized, oh, every animal has a rich emotional life and a deep desire to avoid pain and suffering. And I realized that, like, just as I could not cause suffering for Tucker or contribute to Tucker's suffering, that from that moment on, I couldn't cause or contribute to another animal's suffering. So I became a vegetarian then, and that was 1984, and then a vegan a few years later in 1987.
Talk about that transition in the early days because the landscape at that time was totally different. Now we have all these vegan, vegetarian restaurants and health food stores have so many different packaged options. And I can imagine it was quite different back then. Talk
Yeah,
about what it was like adopting a diet back in the 80s that's a plant based diet.
uh, to put it in perspective, I currently live in Los Angeles, in Los Feliz, and there are more vegan restaurants in a 3 mile radius of my house right now than there were in the entire world in 1987 when I went vegan. Um, so in 1984, when I went vegetarian, it was very challenging because up until that point, I just ate this traditional American diet. I ate salami sandwiches and pepperoni pizza and hamburgers and then I went vegetarian and I suddenly had to figure out how to cook for myself and how to eat. And then in 1987, I read the book Diet for a New America by John Robbins. And that's what turned me vegan. Um, but to also put it in perspective, in 1987, I didn't know any other vegans. I'd never met a vegan. And I only knew of one vegan restaurant in the entire world, which was Angelica's Kitchen, which at that point was on 8th Street in Manhattan. And no one I knew even knew how to pronounce the word vegan. We didn't know if it was vegan or vegan or vegan. So it was challenge being a vegan in 1987, and especially around that time, I was living in an abandoned factory. I lived in an abandoned factory in a crack neighborhood. I was making $2,000 a year DJing, and I didn't have running water or a bathroom near where I squatted in this abandoned factory. And so trying to be a healthy vegan, spending $10 a week on food, it led me to figure out cooking with very rudimentary ingredients at an early age.
Wow. What a period of time in your life. Was Tucker living with you in the factory?
No, Tucker was living with my mom and my stepdad. Yeah, I don't think Tucker would have been. I mean, to be fair, there were a lot of rats in the factory. He could have chased them around, but like, I think Tucker. I mean, also at that point, Tucker was, a middle-aged, almost a senior citizen. Like, so he had a nice, comfortable life with my mom. Sleeping on the couch, and I would not have subjected him to my weird abandoned factory.
So I know you had electricity in the factory and that's how you're able to make music. What would you cook up as a typical meal at that time?
Well, I so my kitchen consisted of I had a hot plate that I borrowed from my grandmother, and a toaster oven that I borrowed from my mom, and I had a blender. And so that was how I made food. One of my staples was I would take Quaker oats and I would grind them in my blender to make oat flour. And I would add water and a bunch of different seeds because seeds were inexpensive, and raisins, and sometimes cranberries. And I would make this thing just like it was like an oat cake that I would make in my toaster oven. And it was so easy and delicious and also incredibly healthful because it was all whole foods, all, well, I don't know, not organic necessarily because I couldn't afford that, but and like one of those oat cakes made in the toaster oven, I mean, if it cost, maybe it cost 50 cents to make it, and I could feed myself, I could eat that for a day basically.
And you mentioned you're DJing at the time. During the day, living in this abandoned warehouse factory, did you have a lot of contact with other humans? I know you'd go visit your mom and stepdad, but were you pretty isolated and just head down working on music at that time?
I mean, I worked a lot, but I also had a remarkable community of friends. And it's one of the things sometimes I get a little wistful for is when you're young, at this point I was what, like 20, 21, you know, my friends and I were all in the same boat. We were all ambitious. We were all working on weird, interesting projects, and none of us had any money. And so there was just that, we were all the same age. We were all, born within a couple of years of each other. We had been friends for a long time. And there was such a sense of community and solidarity. And then as you get older, that disappears, because people move to different parts of the world. People have varying degrees of success or lack of success. Some people start families, some people don't. Some people become weird religious nuts, some people don't. It's like I found that like basically from the age of 23 on, that sort of sense of belonging and community in my life has kind of fractured. So, but at the time because luckily I also had a phone in the abandoned factory. Like I still remember this magical day when I was able to convince whatever it was, the Connecticut phone company to install a phone line. And so somehow I magically had a phone.
Wow. Was anybody else living in the building with you?
It was a huge compound. I mean, massive. I mean, they're like maybe 7 or 8 giant 19th century brick buildings. So millions of square feet. And most of it was empty. There were some artist studios there. Uh, there was some light manufacturing. There was a bunch of warehouse storage space. Um, there was some porn production going on. But in terms of living, I'd say there were maybe 10 other people squatting in the compound. And most of them I didn't know. And it was for a place without that many people, it was also incredibly violent because it was in the middle of a crack neighborhood. So, like, while I lived there, the 3 years that I lived there, 2 people died or were murdered in the compound, which is not a great ratio when you think that there were only 10 people living there. It's like, so yeah, it was not the safest place.
And you mentioned religion there quickly. I know you've, had different periods of your life. You grew up atheist and you've kind of pivoted into Christianity at one point and ended up teaching Bible studies. So you've kind of went the full gamut of the spectrum there. At this time, were you religious at all?
Yeah, strangely enough, I when I was DJing until 4 o'clock in the morning in dive bars. But I was also a weird Christian. And I realized a lot of my belief systems, we talked earlier about how the fact that, like I'm coming from a place of fear and insecurity or inadequacy, a lot of my rigidity, or especially on religion or other things, has been a function of control. You know, I mean, which is why now I wouldn't know how to describe my belief system. I'm certainly not a Christian in any normal sense of the word. I'm not dogmatic. I love a lot of different traditions, but I simply don't think that it's possible for a human being who's a few decades old to have categorical objective knowledge of a universe that's 15 billion years old. So, but at the time, yeah, I was a very serious Christian, um, because I realized in hindsight, it gave me that ability to feel like I was part of a club and I could control my environment. So the good thing about that is it has definitely given me an ability to better understand fundamentalists, whether it's Christian, Islamic, Jewish, Hindu. Like I sort of understand the fundamentalist mindset because I bought into it for a few years.
So we're talking about this period of time in your early 20s. How long is it before you become a public figure?
Uh, it happened very quickly. I mean, I was living in the abandoned factory in 87, 88, into 89. In 1989, I worked up all my courage and I saved a few $100s and I moved to Lower Manhattan with some friends. And within 6 months, I was DJing at an amazing nightclub in Manhattan and I had signed my first record deal. So, and then a year after that, I started releasing records. So it, the the sort of public figure musician stuff started pretty quickly after that.
And how long did it take you before you bought that big apartment? I think it was like a 5-story apartment you had that was looking over Central Park.
Oh, that was quite a lot later. I mean, that was, yeah, I think I bought that crazy, my friends called it the Sky Castle because it really did look like a sky. It was the top of the El Dorado apartment building. If you're bored, you can Google El Dorado Central Park West, and like I had the top 5 levels of it. So I guess when you look at it that way, it is quite a fascinating socioeconomic journey from living on $10 a week and squatting in an abandoned factory in the late 80s to buying a 5 level sky castle on Central Park West. And it was only, I guess it was, to be fair, it was only about 14 years later. So the scope of, span of 14 years from the abandoned factory to the sky castle.
So I'm just trying to put that in the timeline there. Was that after Play?
Yeah. So Play was 1999 that was released then. So Play was released 10 years after I left the abandoned factory.
Got it. So let's talk about it because you are somebody that has a really unique perspective where you've lived dirt poor and you've lived at the other end of the spectrum where you've had these massive homes and anything you want material wise. So let's talk about how when you got there, what that difference was like for you mentally and on a level of happiness.
Uh, I mean, I would say that I bought into the idea that the vast majority of people buy into, um, which was that when when I was growing up, I assumed that if you had fame and a degree of affluence, that happiness would ensue. And then as I started to have fame and affluence, I simply kept waiting for the magical happiness to be created. And it, it didn't come. I mean, certain things made me happy, but I kept trying to sort of, I don't know, like buy or manipulate myself into happiness. And I realized, yeah, there's nothing wrong with a degree of fame or wealth, but inherently they don't create happiness. I mean, if they did, Kanye West and Donald Trump would be two of the happiest people on the planet. If they did, Robin Williams and Anthony Bourdain would be running down the street laughing their heads off right now, just being the happiest people on the planet. Like, I'm not alone in having believed that fame and affluence had magical qualities. And it was really hard slowly admitting to myself that, like, no, fame and affluence are fine, but they don't deliver magical happiness.
Well, the reason I wanted to highlight this, like I said, you're somebody with that unique perspective. It is very cliche for people to talk about, money's not going to make you happy, success and fame aren't going to lead to happiness. But have those people gotten to the level of success and financial level that you've been to? Not necessarily. So you're somebody that has their feet in both these camps and can provide that perspective from a personal experience.
Yeah, I guess there is a uniqueness to that, is that simply very few, and I don't mean this in a self-aggrandizing way, but like very few people have been as poor as I've been, and very few people have been as sort of affluent or successful as I've been. And what I found is just that, yeah, simply there's very little correlation between fame and affluence and happiness. Like I was thousands of times happier living in my abandoned factory making $2,000 a year than I was living in a 5-level penthouse overlooking Central Park. Like like living in the penthouse overlooking Central Park West, I'd never been more depressed. And in hindsight, living in the abandoned factory, I'd almost never been happier. So it's and it's almost, I sometimes think there's, and maybe I'm being completely self-involved, but almost like, not to anthropomorphize the universe, but it almost feels like an interesting object lesson, you know, using me as the object. Like the universe said, like, how can we take this guy who is as humble and insecure and, poor as they come in the United States, and let's see what happens. It's almost like reverse Job. Like, let's see what happens if we make him a rich rock star, and watch as comedy and hilarity and depression ensue.
You mentioned there how in the factory that might have been the happiest time of your life, also the most depressing. If you had to pinpoint one specific period of time in your life when you were the happiest, would the time in the factory be it? Or if you think about it for a minute, would it have been a different time?
I mean, I say the happiest. I mean, to be fair, I'm actually pretty happy now, um, which is weird because a lot of the metrics by which I assessed happiness in the past I don't really care about them anymore. But like, I get to look out my window and see trees, and I get to go hiking, and I get to work on music and animal rights stuff. So even though the world is falling apart and we're in the middle of Delta variant and who knows what other variants are going to come up, like I still have found a way to just be relatively happy with very simple things. And so if we're excluding right now as a happy period, I would say 1992 was a sweet spot, because I was all of a sudden had this burgeoning career as a musician. The rave scene was utopian and delightful. I was suddenly able to like live in an apartment that actually had running water and a bathroom. So and I had a girlfriend at the time. 1992, in terms of naive, sort of delightful happiness, 1992 was pretty good.
And at that time when you're living life day to day, did you fully appreciate it?
Oh no, I just thought, I mean, I thought it was magical that I was able to make records and that sometimes people listen to them, because again, I'd never expected that. Uh, but also I had had very little experience with adulthood. I mean, at the time, 1992, I was 26, 27. And I thought this was adulthood, and the happiness that I was experiencing then, I just assumed it was going to go on forever, and I kind of assumed nothing was going to be complicated moving forward. I mean, also to put it in perspective, globally, it was, you could almost argue it was one of the last periods when globally there was a great sense of optimism. If you think about it, like Bill Clinton was a new president, the Soviet Union had fallen apart, a lot of old dictatorships were falling by the wayside, the internet was being developed. It just was an incredibly optimistic time. And there I was right there, involved in the rave scene with a bunch of great friends, being able to pay the rent for the first time in my life. So it really, you could say like that 92, 93, not just for me, but for the world, was kind of like our last period of genuine, like naive kind of delusional optimism.
And you mentioned that period of time being in New York, and I know at that time your feet on the ground in the grind, but you mentioned the internet there, and I'm curious because you grew around that same period of time that the internet really started to expand, was that integral for your growth? Or do you think it was more just, I guess we could call it a classical growth that would have been for a musician in the 80s or before that?
Yeah, I mean, I still remember the first time someone told me, like really told me about the internet, and email. And it would have been around that time, like 92, 93. Uh, I went on a date, at least I thought it was a date. I don't think she did, with this woman. I remember her name, Nye Garcia Crespo, because it's such a distinctive name. And she was at Columbia at the time. And when we were having dinner, she asked me if I had an email address, and I didn't know what that was. And she said, "Oh, because it would probably be really fun to email with you." And I was like, "I don't know what that means." And then my friend Michael Meacham, because I had a computer, he talked me into buying a modem. And I think it was a 9600 kpbs modem, which at the time was the fastest modem you could get. And that's when I got my first ever, I got an Earthlink account, and I had an email address, and I joined a bunch of news groups. Because this was, to put it in perspective, the World Wide Web didn't exist yet. This was just the internet. This was news groups. And I feel like such an old guy rambling on, but then in around 1994, I remember this person telling me about the World Wide Web, which kind of, as far as I knew, had just been invented. And he said it was a way that you could actually put pictures on the internet. And this was such a revolutionary idea, because before that, it was all text. Like all the news groups, like it was all text. And if you wanted to have pictures, it was pictures that people made out of the characters on a keyboard. Like it was pretty rudimentary. So it obviously grew pretty quickly from there.
Were you an early adopter of like MySpace and connecting with fans using the internet in the early days?
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember building a website. I was one of the first musicians to build a website, to join Friendster, to join MySpace. I mean, it was. Um, I thought it was all utopian and super exciting, and how naive we were to think that social media and bypassing big media organizations was going to be a force for openness and democracy, as we have seen with the last few elections, or what happened with the Rohingya, or what's happened, with right-wing dictatorships around the world. Like clearly, a lot of social media has not been used to promote openness and democracy.
I want to come back to the point in your story when you hit rock bottom, you have your epiphany period of time and you turn things around for the better. And I know at that time you gave up alcohol and became sober, but let's talk about some of the other self care practices and things you did. Maybe it's meditation or, changing up your diet. I know you're a vegan, but changing up your diet to a healthier diet. What are some of the things you did at that time to facilitate your well being?
Well, it reminds me of an AA share I once heard, because you go to an AA meeting and people talk, and there's usually one person who gives a share that's 5, 10, 20 minutes. And I heard this one share, it was on Avenue B and Ninth Street. And it was this really narcissistic, kind of very self-involved hipster alcoholic. And I say that because he would probably say the same thing. And he had this share that was so self-involved. And to his credit, at the end of the share, he suddenly realized what he was doing. And he kind of said, hey, I'm not here to promote myself. I'm not here to, sound tough. And he said, ignore everything I just said. And at the end of his share, he said, just do more of what works and do less of what doesn't. And that really stuck with me. And I was like, oh, because at the core of self-care, at the core of everything is evidence. And I will say to you, people hate evidence. People love holding on to the thought that you can be healthy while you're eating hot dogs and smoking cigarettes. People love holding on to the idea that you can be a good person while you're cheating on your spouse. People love holding on to the idea that you can love animals while eating them. Like we hate evidence. Like people love these paradoxes. And so in terms of self-care, I had to actually start looking at evidence, and figuring things out, and cobbling together a self-care practice that was supported by evidence, not supported by my idea of what should work and not supported by other people's idea of what should work. For example, meditation is a good example. Like I know tons of meditators who are miserable, but they're doing a practice that they're told should work. And that just does that. That's absurd. Meditation should serve the meditator. That's it. Like there's no reason to meditate if you're trying to like make the meditation gods happy or make a teacher happy. Like that's absurd. So figuring out what works, and it's trusting yourself to look at the evidence, and finding that sort of Goldilocks middle ground of like, eating in a way. I mean, obviously I've been a vegan since 87. Like throughout all of my weird travails, the veganism was never questioned. Like to me, that's my core, my rock. Like I would rather die than be involved in anything that caused or contributed to the suffering of an animal. So, but figuring out how to eat, because obviously when I was bottoming out as an alcoholic and a drug addict, I was not eating terribly healthy vegan food. I was eating a lot of like greasy fried vegan food and realizing that was not making me feel good, that was not contributing to health or well-being. So yeah, in terms of self-care practices, it's really figuring it out for the individual and looking, availing yourself of the information that comes from experts, but not doing things just because, like a friend of mine she sort of buys into a lot of these nonsensical self-care practices. For a while, she started drinking turpentine. And I had to say to her, turpentine is a toxin. Just because this insane influencer on Goop says you should drink turpentine, like you shouldn't really be drinking turpentine. So yes, sorry for rambling on, but that practice of figuring things out for ourselves based on evidence and actual real information.
No, I totally agree with that. What works for one person might not work for the other. And I think at different times of our life, different things might work for us. You're now in your 50s, maybe something that worked for you in your 20s or 30s. You have to evolve and pivot as we age, and different times, different things are going to work. So for you at that time, and again, caveating with the fact that this isn't follow what Moby did and it's going to work for you, but what are some of the things that you did and found work for you to really take care of yourself and to up your well-being?
I mean, regarding diet, it's very simple. It's basically organic, like as much as possible, organic, unprocessed foods, and as diverse an array of foods as possible. Obviously all vegan, but like eating, I mean, like, sorry to sound like a hippie, but nature is kind of magical. Like it provides us with perfect foods, organic, whole foods. And if you if you go off of that every now and then and have some vegan onion rings or some vegan fake meat, like that's fine. But this, I really believe that for all of us as humans, like we're designed to eat foods that are high in fiber, that are high in phytonutrients, that are high in antioxidants, that are, high in protein, high in the things that naturally come along with organic whole foods. So that really, like, if I go out and if I spend a week eating vegan junk food, at the end of it I feel like garbage. So I'd say a 95-5 ratio, like 5% questionable vegan junk food and 95% organic whole foods. um, Another huge thing for me is nature. Like, cities are incredibly exciting and dynamic, but I've just found for myself that having daily exposure to nature is so grounding and healing and really transformational. And just being reminded of the natural world, that, like a world that is so much more interesting and complicated than the human world. Uh, and really, like creating a sort of a meditation practice that ideally can do two things. One, create calm when you need calm, but also create insight when you need insight. Because so many of us, myself included, we're victimized by thoughts. We're victimized by feelings. We're victimized by old cognitive patterns. And ideally, a pretty good mindfulness practice should enable us. Mindfulness may be coupled with cognitive behavioral therapy or other therapeutic practices to create some sort of awareness of our thoughts and our feelings so we don't have to be victimized by them.
I'm glad you talked about that inner part as well, because I was going to go there. I'm guessing at the time when you're trashing your body with drugs and alcohol, maybe at that time I'm guessing likely don't have a lot of love for yourself. So there's probably a lot of inward work you had to do to accept yourself and maybe let go of perfectionism and to look inside at, like you said, thoughts and feelings and things that are going on within your head.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the hardest practices for anybody. And I say that presumptuously, but I really truly believe it. And it's an ongoing thing for me as well, is connecting to the awkward, vulnerable part of yourself. Like, it's really easy for us to connect with the angry part of ourselves. It's really easy to even connect with the sort of the saintly part of ourselves. But connecting with that awkward adolescent, which is really who we all are, that vulnerable, awkward self is the core of who I am. It's the core of who we all are. I would almost go so far as to say that that is the true Jungian shadow self, the awkward self, the vulnerable self, you know, at times the gentle, enthusiastic, embarrassing self. That's the challenge, learning to love that and not exercise it, but actually really recognize the the identity that's inherent to that awkward self.
And did it take you a long time to figure out how to do that work and to really love yourself and accept yourself?
Oh, I would say it's an ongoing process. Like, I mean, maybe I'm 5% of the way there. Like, that's, you know, reconciling ourselves or reconciling myself to that awkward shadow self. Like, that's because we all spend so much time avoiding it, trying to moving away from it, trying to pretend it doesn't exist, being embarrassed of it. And, it's kind of hard after a lifetime of trying to kill off the awkward, vulnerable self to then realize, oh, you actually have to engage with it and make peace with it and learn to love it. Like, that's a, you know, there's a reason why very few people talk about making that effort, because it's uncomfortable.
And for you getting in there and doing that work, is that primarily through meditation?
It's through meditation, it's through action, but meditation in a way, I wish the word meditation didn't exist because it means so many different things to so many different people. Uh, as we know, there are types of meditation that are just about like visualizing and entering other realms, or austere Zen meditation, or mantra based meditations, or meditations that are just to create calm. um, they're all great. Like, I'm not criticizing any of those things, but cognitively they all affect the brain so differently. And I love having a sort of an insight practice that enables me to more rationally assess my thoughts and my cognition, but also, like a metta, in the Pali word for loving kindness, like a metta practice that enables you to emotionally connect with those parts of yourself, and a relaxation practice, and a crazy mystical visionary practice, having all these different practices, but they really, even neurochemically, they affect very different parts of the brain. So I'm like wary of that word meditation because it just means such different things to different aspects of our brain.
I hear you. Moby, given that animal rights activism is such a big focus for you at this point in your life, and it has been for a long time, can you talk about what a typical day looks like at this point in your life?
Yeah, well, in terms of activism, like for example, making music is is easy. And when I say that, I don't mean making good music is easy. What I mean is, for me to make music, like, I sit down and play guitar, I sit down and play piano, I go into my studio and I play around with some equipment. Like, that part, that's fun. Making it good is very challenging, but it's still, I understand what to do, which of course does not mean that my music is good or that I'll make good music, but I sort of know how to go about that process. Activism is a bear. Like, it's very challenging because I don't fully believe in the tradition and exclusive, or in utilizing the exclusive traditional venues for activism, which are 501c3s, or maybe even engaging with C4s and PACs. I think that activism could be advanced in a bunch of different strategic ways, through products, through media, um, through social media, through supporting influencers. So every day I try and think, what can I do with traditional activism, which is 501c3s? Uh, as I mentioned, C4s, which in the United States, are you in Canada?
Yes.
Yeah, so sorry, 501c3s and C4s, these are part of US tax code. I don't know what the Canadian equivalent is, but basically nonprofits or political donations. So that's a part of my activist pie, but supporting media and products and venture capital, even because in the world of animal rights activism, a huge part of our activism is products. Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, Memphis Meats. I mean, these are really important activist tools. And then media, you know, like, I mean, so many movies, whether it's Game Changers or Forks Over Knives or Cowspiracy or What the Health or Vegucated, like identifying these projects and trying to either give them free music, give them money. So it's all of those, trying to do all of those things, as opposed to, and sorry for rambling on, but as opposed to music, where I go into my studio and I make music. Straightforward, simple. Activism, to be a good activist, it's constant questioning and strategic application.
Got it. And activism aside, where else are you focusing your time throughout the day?
Uh, well, I've started a film and TV production company that is supposed to, it's ideally a function of activism as well. So we're trying to develop some documentaries, some scripted series, unscripted series, some features. So I work on that. Uh, Music, which to me is basically at this point a refuge. It's a refuge from trying to be a smart adult. And then the self-care aspect of, going hiking, doing yoga, reading books, meditating, playing music for the love of meditation, cooking, being in nature. Like, so that's 7 days a week. I don't take days off, and I don't take holidays or vacations because I don't like days off and I don't like holidays or vacations. I like my daily routine of music, activism, work, and exercise in nature.
Got it. Moby, this has been a lot of fun. I know I got to let you go. How can listeners and viewers connect with you after the show?
Uh, I mean, good old social media. I'm on Instagram and all the other places. And the one thing I would ask is, because if you're thinking of buying, and maybe this is a terrible thing to say, if you're thinking of buying one of my records, I'd rather you download it for free and go buy a record by a small band who needs money more. Like I'm okay. I try to give whatever money I make from music, books, etc. Like I try to give it all to nonprofits, but still support local bookstores, support local record stores, support small authors, support small musicians. Like no one no one needs to be giving money to musicians or whatever who are already relatively affluent.
Very nice of you. And I'm going to link everything up in the show notes. Moby, really enjoyed going deep with you, covering a lot of different aspects of your story, of your life. I appreciate your honesty, vulnerability, and the work you're doing in the world. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. And congratulations on being Canadian these days. I feel like, like even though I'm not dating, I feel like I would marry a Canadian in a heartbeat because boy, oh boy, I think over the next 10 years, having a Canadian passport is going to become super precious. Not that it isn't already.
That's funny. Well, take care, Moby. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.